Good afternoon, everyone. We live in extraordinary times. The Europe and Israeli cloud ecosystem is accelerating like never before, and we cannot be more excited to be here today. My name is Philippe Botteri. I'm a partner with Accel, based in London, and I'm here with my colleague Candice Dufretet and Varun Purandare to present the finding of the 2021 Accel Euroscape, the list of the most promising 100 cloud companies from Europe and Israel. 5 years ago, back in 2016, Europe and Israel had only 4 public cloud companies, which were worth less than 9 billion combined. And private cloud companies had only raised 900 million over the course of 2015. If we look at where we are today, Europe and Israel have created 23 public companies, which are worth together more than $230 billion. The private cloud financing has reached $30 billion year to date, and the largest round of 2021 was $1 billion raised by Celonis, and it is larger than the capital raised by the entire ecosystem in 2015. So this year, we think we earned the right to ask the question, are Europe and Israel on the path to global dominance? Before attempting to answer this question, let's have a look at what happened in the global software and cloud market over the last year. So the world has now 10 software and cloud giants. We call giants companies that are worth more than $100 billion in market cap. Together, these 10 companies represent more than $4 trillion of market value. As you can see on the slide, the world of giants is largely dominated by one colossus, Microsoft. Microsoft represents more than half the entire basket. And of course, the success has been driven by the development of Azure and the shift of all of their products to the cloud. Now let's look at the private markets. The numbers there are also supersized. There were 3 IPOs north of $20 billion this year in the global cloud ecosystem. The time to become a unicorn is record-breaking. You can see 14 months for Wiz, a security company out of Israel, 17 months for Hopin, which we're actually using right now. And there were 3 mega rounds, which were north of $1 billion. If we look at these results, it is striking to see the show of force of Europe and Israel. They have the 2 largest, with the largest IPO, a few iPads, the 2 fastest unicorn, and one of the top 3 rounds. So now it really feels right to ask the question of whether Europe and Israel are on the path to global dominance. But before we go there, let's take a deeper look at the public and private markets. So overall, if we look at our global cloud index, the performance continues to be very strong, and the index together added another $1 trillion of value over the past year, which is roughly similar to what happened the year before. If we look at the multiples, the multiples in September this year are slightly higher than last year, but they are a bit off their peak, which happened in around February. They were at 20 times forward revenue. Today they're around 17. Now, if we look at the number of IPOs, the number of IPOs nearly doubles in 2021 with 32 IPOs globally, which raised a total of $23 billion. And this is compared to 17 IPO in 2020. That said, these IPOs are a bit different from last year. They have lowered forward revenue multiple on average, so 19x this year versus 27x last year. And more importantly, if we look at the mix of IPO, last year you had 60% of the IPO with a market cap of north than $5 billion versus it's only 28% this year. So basically, with the public market window wide open, we have seen smaller companies making their way to the public market, where last year the crop of public companies were larger. Now we also took a look at the SPACs. As you know, there were a lot of noise around SPACs and in the past 12 to 18 months. But from a cloud perspective, very few companies opted for this option. Actually, we only had 11 companies in 2021, so much less than the 32 IPO. And the other thing which is worth noting is that the average market cap of the IPO was around $7 billion versus only $3 billion for SPACs. So we cannot talk about the market without talking about M&A. And so it's always interesting to compare M&A to the amount of cash which is available on the balance sheet of the big software companies which can actually make this M&A happen. And so if we look at the total cash balance available, in the cloud giants and in the cloud companies on the index, it is around $330 billion. So this is a huge amount of dry powder. Now, if we look at the top 3 strategic M&A of the year, I mean, obviously Slack at 28 billion was one of the top cloud M&A ever. And we had, MailChimp and Auth0, which were also very large cloud M&A. But overall, the 3 of them combined represent only 47 billion in market value. So if you compare the 47 billion to the 330 billion of cash, which is sitting on the balance sheet, you could say that this M&A market could have been more active this year. Our thinking on this, our hypothesis is that basically, given that the multiples are quite high right now, I think this dry powder is kind of waiting to see if at some point, and I say if, at some point the multiple corrects to get into action. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months with all this cash sitting on the sideline. Now, if we turn our eyes to the private market, I mean, the private market have been super dynamic. Overall, in the US, Europe, and Israel, there's been $78 billion invested year to date in private market, and the number of unicorns are nearly double, from 130 to 226. And what is even more remarkable is that the amount of financing which went into private cloud companies, so the $78 billion we just mentioned, basically dwarfed the amounts raised by the public companies on the cloud index, which was only $45 billion. And probably a lot of that has been driven by hedge funds, which are now looking at investing in the private tech markets. So this was an overview of the global cloud market. Now let's dive into what happened in Europe and Israel, and my colleague Candice will walk you through our findings.
Thank you, Philippe. If the global cloud market is growing fast, Europe and Israel are even growing faster. Market value has reached 230 billion plus and has more than doubled in the last year. Leveraging more than 20 hubs in the region, an unprecedented level of entrepreneurial talent and ambitions, as well as full access to global capital markets, Europe and Israeli startups have nothing to envy their US counterparts, and the numbers speak for themselves. Since the start of 2021, Europe and Israel have generated 11 new IPOs versus 3 in the whole year of 2020. These new IPOs also sustain high multiples in the 2022 range. These new companies have raised a total of 6 billion, including 3 monster IPOs, UiPath, SentinelOne, and Monday.com, which account for 55% of this total 6 billion raised. And we have a very promising IPO pipeline for the next 12 to 24 months. On the private side, the magnitude of the growth in cloud private funding is also unprecedented, with 30 billion raised by private cloud companies in Europe and Israel, a 3 times jump from last year. This influx of capital has pushed the number of unicorns from 44 companies end of 2020 to 81 companies as of end of September 21. This increased ambition and the footprint is rewarded by investors, as 14 of these unicorns are now valued at more than 5 billion in 2021. Looking more closely at the region, it's undeniable that Israel is emerging as the cloud factory of the region, with 16 new unicorns in 2021, roughly a third of all the new additions. Israel also has by far the largest number of unicorns per capita, with 2.9 unicorn per million of people versus 0.1 to 0.3 for the other major hubs like France, UK, or Germany. The success of Israel relies on the combination of a few factors: incredible talents coming from army units and local subs of large tech companies, expertise in areas supported by secular trends, such as cloud security, infrastructure, and payments, but also a dense network of seed funds ready to invest large amounts at pre-product stage, as well as access to global capital at growth stage. Now let's ask the question: are Europe and Israel on path to global dominance? All of the data points point to the fact that Europe and Israel are on the path to be as fertile a ground for cloud as the US, and potentially even more fertile in the coming years. The number of public companies from Europe and Israel nearly doubles in 2021 versus grows only by 30% in the US, albeit on a higher basis. Overall metrics are comparable. US still is leading in private funding volume with 48 billion raised year to date, but Europe and Israel at 29 billion is catching up very fast. Because if you look at the growth rates, Europe and Israel is growing 3.2 times versus 2.4 in the US. Now it's time to unveil the Euroscape. Handing it off to you, Varun.
Thank you, Candice. This year, the criteria to select the top 100 companies has remained largely the same as previous years. We've added a new blockchain and crypto category to reflect the many fast-growing companies that we're seeing in this sector. Companies tend to be at earlier stages than previous years, since we don't consider companies that are already unicorns in the top 100. All right, and here it is, the top 100 European and Israeli companies that make up the 2021 Euroscape. We will let this slide be on the screen for a couple of minutes and give you a few interesting stats. So most of the companies in the 2021 Euroscape were founded between 2 and 6 years ago. They have less than 200 employees and have raised less than 50 million US dollars. Euroscape winners in total have raised around $6 billion. The finance, HR, and legal category has produced the most winners, and the categories that attracted the most dollars are finance, HR, legal, security, and automation. 4 geos, UK, Israel, France, and Germany, make up around 70% of the companies on this list. And then there's a long tail from the rest of Europe. And now, to conclude our presentation, let's have a look at what's ahead for the cloud ecosystem in Europe and what gets us excited for the future. We think there are 6 key trends which will shape the cloud landscape in the next couple of years. The first trend is we're going to see more automation in enterprises. The range of use cases for automation is expanding to address more complex business processes, and more organizations will create fully automated value chains. Second, new algorithms and deep learning solutions are lowering the bar when it comes to creating highly realistic content, like programmable avatars using a simple text editor. Third, security platforms will increasingly focus on cloud. As business applications and IT infrastructure continues to shift to the cloud, the need for cloud security will continue to increase and address misconfigurations and code vulnerabilities. Fourth, the APIification of fintech infrastructure. Banking infrastructure tooling is now becoming more productized and is addressing non-fintech use cases. Access to non-banking data, such as payroll, insurance, credit, and ERP through APIs, is also enabling new use cases. Fifth, we're seeing a rapid rise of crypto and DeFi infrastructure. Institutional demand is rising, and major banks and payment players are now incorporating crypto payments and custody solutions. In addition, consumer demand is exploding as online exchanges, neo-brokers, and digital banks act as enablers. And finally, there's an increasing infrastructure for the anywhere workforce. As the world shifts to a hybrid workplace, mixing office and remote work, the need for new collaboration tools and the tools to manage these workers is increasing. And now I'll hand it off to Philippe to wrap up our presentation.
Well, thank you, Varun. I mean, when we went through all these numbers to prepare the 2021 Accel Euroscape, I must say that it was really mind blowing. I think it was mind blowing to see that Europe was actually at the top of the leaderboard. In many aspects. I mean, Europe had the largest IPO and they are the fastest growing unicorn. I mean, this is something that we could have never dreamed about, in 2016. The other thing which is really remarkable is that globally, all cloud companies and cloud unicorns have access to record amounts of capital. Like it is the first time, I think, in venture when private companies can have, 100, 200, 300, $1 billion of cash on their balance sheets. And what does this mean for these companies? Well, it means that, obviously, they have a lot of freedom to grow, but also put a lot of pressure to go out and capture the market they're in as soon as possible. And so we're seeing this cash invested into talent, of course. I think what really matters if you're a cloud company, there are two things that really matter. One is build the product, and the second thing is sell the product, right? So companies are investing very heavily into their roadmap to accelerate their roadmap, add new product to their platform so that they can upselling and keep the net retention rates very high. That said, there's a limit to the number of people you can hire. It's becoming increasingly harder to find talents. And so the other thing that we're seeing in this ecosystem is that we're seeing now cloud companies, the large cloud companies, on the private side, making small acquisition. And why is it the case? Because now they can. I mean, 4 to 5 years ago, a $50 million round was a very large round. But when you have only $50 million on your balance sheet, you cannot buy a company for $100 million. Now, if you have, 4, 5, $600 million on your balance sheet, then suddenly you can buy companies for $100 million. And that's a great way to, buy technology talents or buy customers to expand your footprint faster. So we're seeing these new trends of M&A in the private market, and we think that's going to really accelerate. So it's been very exciting for us to see all the developments that we're seeing in the market. Obviously, this led us to ask the question, and which was the theme of this year, which is Europe and Israel on the path to global dominance? I think what we're seeing today is that you look at unicorn, you look at what's happening on the public market. I think the quality of the company that we're seeing, the amount of capital they have access to is really equal. Euros is still dominating in terms of volume, but in terms of the quality of the company we're seeing and the potential and the innovation, this is very similar and comparable. And at the end of the day, which region attracts the largest amount of capital and isn't, I think, the most important point. I think what really matter is that innovation in the clouds ecosystem can now come from anywhere in the world. The world of cloud is really getting flat. At Accel, we've been a big believer in clouds in the early days of the shift. I mean, today, as you can see on the slide, we have invested $7 billion in more than 300 companies globally, and I've worked with many exceptional cloud founders, and we have the privilege to do so, from Australia to India, the US, Europe, and Israel. And it's very inspiring to see that the world of cloud is now totally global, that any region can generate a category-defining company. From Atlassian in Australia to UiPath in Romania, to Celonis in Germany, to Snake in Israel, and DocuSign and CrowdStrike in the US, and many more. So we are actually super excited about the time we live in now, and we can't wait to see what the next year is what's gonna happen in the next year, and we really look forward to seeing all of you for the 2022 Accel Euroscape. So rendezvous is taken for next year. And I see as we have a bit of 30-second or a minute left. So if there are any questions from the audience, we'll be very happy to take it.
Thanks, Philippe and Varun and Candice there. Fantastic, great to see Europe leading the way in some of the league table stats there. I think in terms of taking questions, probably the best thing to do, if you're able to spare the time, to jump on to Hopin, as we're on StreamYard. It's one of its M&A acquisitions through last year. So if you're able to jump on to Hopin and onto the chat and answer some questions there, I'm sure we'll see some good interaction on that. So just want to thank you for the great work there and opening up SaaStock once again. And like you said, Philippe, can't wait to see 2022 and what happens in the next 12 months and actually see it live in person in Dublin as well. So looking forward to that. So thanks everybody for a great presentation and a great opening to SaaStock EMEA.
Well, thank you, Alex. And I just want to say that, this was 20 minutes was a very short time, so the report is much larger. So all this report is going to be available if you go to my LinkedIn profile. You see the full blog post and access to the slides, which will be on SlideShare.
Amazing, good stuff. Thank you very much.